Hi, my name is Ed Walsh and I'm a series audit editor with Collins. Thank you very much indeed for tuning in to this wonderful piece of technology which is going to enable us to share some ideas and to answer some questions as well. And I'd like to start off by saying really interested and very keen to answer any questions that you do have, so please do send those questions in. We've got some that have been sent in already. We'll make sure that any questions that are sent in we either answer during this or alternatively that we get back to you afterwards. We're very keen to make sure that anything that you raise that we've dealt with. As I said, my name's Ed Walsh. I'm a series editor for the Collins GCSE materials and also the Key Stage 3 ones as well. I was a science teacher for 20 years, 12 of them as a team leader. I then came out of my classroom and started going into a lot of other people's classrooms doing school improvement work. As well as writing and editing textbooks, I also run CPD sessions and train student teachers and so forth. And this has been really quite an exciting, it's been quite challenging, but really quite an exciting period as well, with new specifications. And of course, we're at a particularly crucial point now with Year 11 students being the first group of students that are going through on the new GCSE specifications. So what I wanted to do to start off with was just to cover one or two points that when I've been running CPD sessions, that these are, if you like, the FAQs. These are the questions that keep coming up, and so therefore I thought it might be worthwhile exploring these a little bit to start off with. And one of the questions, of course, is usually to do with the grading system, because as you know, we're going to a new grading system. It's going to numbered grades as opposed to the old lettered grades, and very understandably a number of teachers are saying we don't know what a particular grade is worth. And I think it's worthwhile making 2 points. The first of those points is that, yes, it is a new grading system, and teachers who say that there isn't a one-to-one equivalence between the old grades and the new grades, you're absolutely right. However, there are fixed equivalences, and Ofqual have been very emphatic about this all the way through. So we know, for example, that the threshold that previously would have got students a grade C, that same threshold will get students a grade 4. So the CD threshold and the 3/4 threshold are going to be just the same as they were previously. And the same pegged equivalence will also work with the old grade A, the kind of performance that's needed in order to get a grade A, that threshold of performance will be the same that will get a grade 7. And there's also a pegged equivalence between grade G and grade 1 as well. So there are those 3 fixed points. And what I think is really worthwhile bearing in mind, of course, you know, any amount of experience that you've got, you soon learn to recognise the kind of performance in students' work that gets them a grade C. Well, in the new scheme, that will be the kind of performance that will tip them over into getting a grade 4. So although that there are some new features with this, actually that there are a lot of things that, you know, we can draw upon that existing experience and make that work. Another of the questions that comes up as well is what's happening with students working at grades 1, 2 and 3, because there's been a lot of emphasis upon students getting grade 5 or accessing high grades. And of course what a number of people are conscious of is that, you know, these new specifications, they're pretty challenging. They were designed to be that way. And what about students who are aiming at grades 1, 2 and 3? I think it's really worthwhile drawing attention to the fact that the exam papers are ramped in terms of challenge. And this is done quite intentionally so that the earlier questions are designed to be low demand questions. And it's worthwhile going back to the sample assessment materials and looking at those low demand questions and actually seeing the way in which they're structured, the kind of terminology that's used, the use of illustrations and the use of examples and so forth. There was one I was looking at quite recently, which was a question. It's a question about a moose, and there was a large picture of a moose that, you know, that appeared out at the page there, and it was designed to be a very accessible question. So I think that, you know, that we've got a number of items already that we can use to get a sense of what students working at those kind of grades are going to be faced with. And we'll also get a sense fairly soon as well about the number of marks that they need. I'm not an examiner, but I think it's fairly safe to say that a fairly modest number of marks will start to get people on the grades. I think the final thing, before we start taking questions, that I would want to draw attention to, there have been a number of requests for more sample questions, and we know that the awarding organisations are very conscious of this. And there will be more sample questions that will be made available over the next few months. So if, for example, if you're looking to put together mock exam papers, the awarding organisations are keen to provide questions of the style that will be in the terminal exams next summer. And so therefore, giving students the practice that they really need to be faced with what a real paper feels like, there's going to be opportunities for them doing that. Okay, well, I think we've got one or two questions here. Are we ready to pitch in with a question here too? Lovely, thank you.
We have a question from a teacher. How important is it that students need to show they're working out when answering a question?
Okay, right, that's a really good question. It is about showing working out. This is one of these areas where things haven't changed. It's really good practice. Students should really be encouraged to show they're working out. If they answer a question that involves a calculation and they get the right answer, they'll get 4 marks. There's no two ways about that. But if they slip up at some point, but they've nevertheless shown they're working out, and the working out is an appropriate way of working it out, they can still get most of the marks, even if the final answer was wrong. So, for example, if they slipped a decimal place or something like that, they can still get most of the marks if they've demonstrated the working out. But the other reason why I think it's important as well is that when students then go back over their answers, of course, if they've shown their own working out, it's given them a mechanism as well to actually look at what it is that they put down and to actually check their working. So I think there are 2 good reasons. Straight answer is that yes, that they really should show that. It's good practice and they should be encouraged. I think we've got another question now.
Do my students need to worry too much about spelling technical words?
Okay, the situation with GCSE papers has changed a little bit. With the papers that finished last summer, you'll be aware that students were assessed on what was known as QWC, or QWC, Quality of Written Communication. Quality of Written Communication is no longer being assessed through GCSE science papers. However, students are still expected to construct extended written responses. As far as the spelling of words goes, the crucial thing is that the examiner should be able to understand pretty easily, without having to sweat it too much, whether they can make out what it is that a student is trying to communicate. So if the meaning is quite clear, then generally speaking, an examiner will give credit. So the straight answer to the question is that the more proficient students are at that, the more efficiently that they'll be able to communicate. But if at the end of the day, if they spell hydrochloric acid with an I rather than a Y, they're not going to drop a grade on that. I think we've got another question now.
A teacher made a comment that they were having difficulty getting students to remember equations. What should they do?
Okay, the thing about learning equations is a really important point because, I think it's pretty widely known that there are 2 lists of equations, and one of those lists, a fairly lengthy list, is one that an examiner can ask students to recall. And I think that there are 3 points that are worthwhile making about this. The first thing is that although the examiner can ask students to recall those, the examiner doesn't have to ask that. So if an examiner is writing a question that is a low demand question, even though that the equation could be asked for, sometimes the examiner won't ask for that, but they will provide that in the question. So students shouldn't be too surprised to see that sometimes an equation that maybe they've been trying to learn, in some cases they will actually be given that, particularly if it's a low demand question. That will be less the case when it comes to standard and high demand. The second thing is that learning equations is one of these things, in one sense, that this is not a new challenge that's been around for some time. And what my advice and that of many other people who have been in the classroom for quite a long time is that it's a case of little and often. It's a case of finding how many ways it is that we can revisit this. It's always worthwhile seeing if you can steal some ideas from modern languages, because modern languages are quite often quite adept at coming up with ways of revisiting vocabulary, and this is a not dissimilar challenge. One of the strategies that I know that a number of teachers use for enabling students to revise equations is by going onto a website that is called Tarsia, and that's spelled Tarsia. And what Tarsia does, it's a free online resource. You put in all the equations and it comes up with a kind of jigsaw, which is then an activity that students can then use to match the two halves of equations. It's not a particularly good way for teaching the equations in the first place, but it's a very good way of giving students a tool that once again they can come back to. It's also worthwhile having a chat with colleagues in maths if you haven't already done so, because if you can make common cause with those guys there about ways of getting students learning those things. But as I said, I think it's a case of little and often. There are probably no shortcuts on that, but you're right to identify that as being a priority. Do we have another question then, please?
Yeah. How do I know whether to enter students for foundation or the higher tier?
Okay, the question about foundation tier and higher tier is a really important point, and of course, in one sense, that's not a new question. That there have been foundation higher tier papers previously, but the first point that's worthwhile making is that the boundary has now moved. So what's happening with this is that foundation tier, of course, runs up to and including a grade 5. And that's higher than foundation tiers ran up to previously. Now, that doesn't mean that there isn't a dividing line between higher tier performance and foundation tier performance, but it's not in quite the same place that it was before. The second thing that's worthwhile pointing out is that if students do the higher tier paper, that goes down to and including a grade 4, there is a very narrow margin for students who just miss a grade 4 to get a grade 3, but that really is a narrow margin. And generally speaking, my advice personally would be, if you think a student is going to come out with a grade 4, I think it's questionable as to whether they should be doing a higher tier paper. The other thing that's worthwhile saying as well is that it's worthwhile really focusing upon that when it comes to the mock exams, which you'll probably want to use using the next set of sample assessment materials. What all of the awarding organisations are doing, and it's a requirement from Ofqual that they do this, the foundation tier papers and the higher tier papers have common questions. So exactly the same questions come up in that overlap zone between foundation tier and higher tier. And I think what's really important with the mock exams is that you look at those crossover questions, you make sure that there are crossover questions there, you look at those crossover questions, those common questions, and you say, how are my students doing on those crossover questions? If they're getting most of the marks on a crossover question, they're probably headed for higher tier. If they're struggling to pick up the marks on those, then probably foundation tier is where they should be entered. I think we've got another question through now.
Yes, teachers commented that they don't know what questions will come up with required practicals and how should they tackle that.
Okay, the question about the required practicals is really quite an interesting one because, of course, that's one of those things that is a new feature of these specifications. And one of the things I think is really important here when you're looking at the required practicals is also to bear in mind the assessment objectives, because the assessment objectives, which really drive the design of exam papers very clearly, the assessment objectives have been modified from the ones in the previous specifications. So all three of the assessment objectives now include reference to working scientifically. And this is really important because what it means is that the questions are not simply going to be about knowledge and understanding, they're also going to be questions about application, and they're also going to be questions on interpretation and evaluation. So whereas it's important that students are familiar with the required practicals that they've done, it's also important that the focus isn't simply upon recording details of those, that an examiner could very well ask them to apply those ideas to a different context or to interpret or evaluate information. Again, what's going to be really important here is looking at the sample assessment materials, both those that are out already and those that come out soon, and look very carefully at the kind of items that examiners have produced around the required practicals, because we know that they certainly won't all be knowledge and understanding questions.
A final question is that the teacher has no idea what grade 4 looks like. So how should they...
Okay, so if for example, if you were looking at a mock exam and saying, well, okay, I can mark this, I can give a score, but I don't know where the grades come, the important thing with this is to think back to the way that the grading system ran for the previous specification. And if you look at the general performance that a student has come up with, the kind of terminology they use, the quality of the explanations, the ways that they're performing calculations and so on and so forth. And if your professional instincts are telling you that that's a student who would have got a grade C, then that student under the new scheme is the kind of student who will get a grade 4. It's worthwhile looking at the experience of Maths and English from last summer, because what happened there, that was the first run through for what Ofqual referred to as equivalent performance. And if you look at that data, the proportion of students who were pulling in a grade 4 or higher was within a percentage point of the students previously that were pulling in a grade C or higher. And the same thing happened at grade A and grade 7 under the new scheme as well. And if you're interested in following up this argument a little bit further, there was a blog piece that I wrote that's on the Freedom to Teach site, and that's called Reading the Runes, and it explores that in a little bit more detail there. I think that's about all the time that we've got for in terms of questions. Thank you very much indeed for staying with us through this. I hope you found it interesting and useful. Please don't regard this as being the end of the opportunity to pitch questions. You know how to enter the questions. Please do send them through, and we'll make sure that we get back to you. Thank you very much indeed.